Hello, everyone. Welcome again, and thanks for being here today. It's the first day of Peralta Online Equity Conference. It's 10 a.m. in the morning, so thank you so much for showing up. So I'm Didem Ekici. I am an ESOL instructor and online equity trainer at Peralta Community College District. And I'm really excited to share my work building allyship through intercultural competence and DEI. This is actually based on a chapter that I wrote. So it might be a little bit literature heavy, theoretical framework heavy, but hopefully you will also have some getaways from it. And also feel free to chime in anytime. I really like to have my presentations conversational. So you can use the chat box to share your questions and I'm happy to read them loud. Or at the end of the session, we're going to have a Q&A part if you have time, so that feel free to jump in then as well. And meanwhile, as I mentioned before, please use the chat box to tell us where you're coming from. And this is a great networking opportunity. Even though in online conferences, we have this a little bit limited, but yeah, let's get together, share your LinkedIn account so that we can also connect through LinkedIn as well. Also, if you can also use captions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a closed caption button. So you can always turn it on and off, clicking on that link. And let's see how successful it is to catch my Turkish accent. You can also try that out. Okay, let's get started. So as I mentioned, this work is from a book chapter. That's why it is a little bit literature heavy, but hopefully you will get some theories, some concepts clarified in this presentation. So let's see what we're going to do for the rest of the session. So first, I'm going to clarify some terminology for you, even though we always hear DEI, intercultural competence, allyship, what they are actually. So we're just going to go over those terms quickly. And after that, we're going to talk a little bit about DEI initiatives in workplaces, especially considering all the pushback we're getting about DEI. What is going on and what can we do for more equitable workplaces? And when I say workplace, it doesn't have to be in higher education institution. It can be anywhere. All the things I'm going to share today are applicable to any workplace environment. And we will also talk about role of ICC intercultural competence in diversity, equity, and inclusive initiatives. So when you look at the EI frameworks, they're all there. You can find so many resources. But if you look at the intersection of ICC and DEI, these resources are a little bit limited in the literature. And we will talk about the reasons about that as well. And lastly, we're going to talk about suggestions for successful DEI implementation in any workplace. So let's start with the terminology. DEI, we always hear this, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a conceptual framework. And it is based on the idea that everyone should be treated fairly and everyone should be participate in any work environment, any work, any task, especially populations that have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination. And this is, APA says because of their background, identity, disability, but we can add more on this list, right? So we can talk about religion, we can talk about ethnicity, we can talk about, even though background can include most of them, we can still increase the number of things in this list. And ICC, which is intercultural competence, is the ability to encounter effective and appropriate communication in intercultural interactions. But I would like to also point out that effective and appropriate, this is discussed so much in the literature, because what is effective or what is appropriate? Appropriate for whom? So this is always discussed. So there is still some ambiguity in the literature about these terms. Tokenism. So we will talk a lot about this today because We see this a lot, actually. I'm not sure if you call it tokenism or something else, but in some institutions, DEI is implemented only on paper, not in practice. So, and there are different reasons for that, because if you show that you have a diverse organization or employees, you will get more funding and you will at least show this in your report, annual report. So tokenism is referring to that type of effort for DEI, not the actual practice or hands-on things on DEI. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Allyship is the efforts of people from privileged groups to support and advocate for colleagues from the marginalized communities. So we have privileged groups and we have marginalized groups. So we are actually looking how these privileged groups can support and advocate for marginalized communities. So these are the terminologies we're going to be using in this presentation. Hopefully they are clear for you at this point. Yes, let's talk about the EI before it's forbidden to talk about it. So why do we have so much controversial discussion about DEI, right? So on one hand, we know that diversity in workplace has potential to increase the productivity and problem solving, and bring creative and innovative ideas on the table, because we have so many people from different backgrounds, different cultures, like in this conference, and mitigate stereotypes and promote a more respectful and healthier atmosphere. So this is what literature is saying about diversity. So you have to have diverse environments so that you're going to have all those benefits. But let's look at the challenges as well. So people are a little bit hesitant to implement DEI sometimes or talk about it sometimes. And this is because, number one, fear among people from the dominant groups, or let's say privileged people, their fear of change and loss of power. And I'm sure you're hearing this a lot. What if they come and I go? What if they work harder than me? And then, all these things are real fear that people are experiencing. And that's one of the most important challenges of DEI, implementation of DEI, because some people don't want to lose any power. And the other is the misconception that everyone has equal opportunities and there's no discrimination taking place in work environment. So in other words, it's kind of like ignorance. So you ignore that there's discrimination, you ignore that there's inequity. So when you have this ignorance, then you feel like, oh, there's no need for DEI work, right? And lastly, tokenism, as I mentioned, institutions desire to make financial benefit and reputation when it gets stronger than their efforts for creating an equitable and inclusive workplace. So tokenism we see especially during the hiring process. I'm sure you're also familiar with that. Sometimes DEI is like only check boxes that you can just put marks in it, which is like, oh, I'll hire this many people from diverse backgrounds, check. But actually DEI is not something that you can implement on paper. So that is why it's called tokenism, and it is so common in DEI work. So why important? Why important is what? why do we need to differentiate how DEI is implemented on paper and in practice? Because if we don't implement DEI correctly, it might have some adverse effects, like promoting racism, rather than dismantling it by excluding people from minority groups. So if you don't implement DEI effectively, you will have diverse effects, which means that you have to be careful as you are doing that, right? And it seems like we're not doing a good job on that, because according to a worldwide study, 75% of employees from minority groups did not find their organization's diversity work beneficial. 75 is a big number. And it means that we either don't know how to implement DEI or we don't pay attention to implementing it correctly. But something is wrong here, right? So let's take a look at what might be wrong. So one of the things that makes DEI so ineffective is because of bottom-up approach rather than, top-down approach rather than bottom-up approach, right? When you implement DEI bottom-up, it is more authentic and more successful because you let people do the work instead of just like coming from top-down approach and explaining people what they need to do. And also creating spaces where individuals from dominant group raise awareness of their privilege. So some people deny that, or some people make excuses like, okay, I'm privileged because, etc. But how can we make sure we are raising awareness of those privileges and how it impacts other people? And lastly, not ending the DEI efforts in the hiring process, as I mentioned before, because the actual work starts afterwards. You hire diverse people, which is great and which is a wonderful first step, but the actual work starts afterwards. How do you make them, all these diverse people, feel included? So that is the most important part of DEI work. So we're going to take a look at DEI, and I'm going to add one more thing here, intercultural competence. So unfortunately, when we look at the literature, when you look at the practice, DEI is always DEI and emphasized, but intercultural competence, which I feel like is the glue of DEI, is the most essence, the most important essence of DEI is not given the attention it deserves, right? So that's why I would like to explore the intersection of these terms and how they can be used together so that DEI efforts will be more effective in the workplace, in any workplace. And the first intercultural competence skill I'm going to explore is active listening. So I'm going to ask you, how many of you are really good at active listening? I mean, sometimes we're having some challenges, right? Because there are so many reasons. But even though listening or active listening is kind of seen like an easy thing to do, actually it's not. It's not. And there are some reasons for that. Some reasons that prevent people from practicing active listening are focusing on their own responses. So as I'm listening to you, I'm just preparing my response. I'm just getting ready for how I'm going to respond to you, right? Instead of just really listening what you're saying. And we're doing it every time, everywhere. As you're talking to your spouse, as you're talking to your children, as you're talking to your friends, we're so focused on our own responses that sometimes we miss things as we listen. And the things we miss, they don't have to be verbal things. They might be some mimics or some body movements that we're missing as we're talking or thinking about our own response. So that's one of the barriers of active listening. The other thing is being distracted by an idea. As the other person is talking, you're just all of a sudden realize, oh, okay. And then you're thinking about another thing as you're listening. And we are human beings. That's okay. We can be distracted by an idea. We can be distracted by something else. But we have to acknowledge that this is something against active listening. And interpreting the input based on their experiences, which might cause conflict or misunderstanding. So what you are sharing, so when you're just giving me that input, when I listen to you, I'm going to take it and put it in my brain. But when I put it in my brain, it will be combined with my own experiences and own perception of life, which may not be the same as yours. So that will change my interpretation of your experiences, and which is okay, which is quite normal. Everyone is doing that, but we have to be aware of that as well. So sometimes we think that we understand other people, but it may not be accurate. So and research shows that active listening allows for two fundamental components of DEI. Number one, perspective taking, and number two, decreasing attitude extremity. But again, we're talking about active listening, not just listening, because when you listen that person actively, you understand the perspective and you understand your own attitudes as well, right? And in terms of allyship, since this is our topic, a true ally, this is taken from RF et al. 2022, a true ally will acknowledge the limits of their knowledge regarding the experiences of marginalized groups and seek opportunities to learn and grow. So if you feel like you don't know enough about the other person or other group or other ethnicity, that is totally okay. Because as long as you're open to learning more, it shouldn't be a problem. We cannot know everything. We cannot be knowledgeable about every culture, every diverse background. But willingness to learn more or being open to learn more is the first step. And never feel like you're going to be judged or criticized by the other person, because as you approach with an open mind and try to learn more, then I'm sure you will be respected by other person as well because of your efforts to learn more. So this is an important step in allyship. And in terms of active listening, it's also important in everyday life, as again, among our family members too. When we're listening, are we really listening? You know, just think about it after this conference. Just ask this yourself, and hopefully, it will bring some self-awareness. And another important quote I would like to share from Palmer and Mehta, and active listening is all about revealing, hearing, and understanding seen and unseen others. I love this quote, seen and unseen others. And this can be done only through active listening. And I'm going to talk about something at the very end, but let me tell you again here too. UNESCO has a story circle methodology that implements active listening. So it's free source. You can use it on your in your institution. You don't have to pay anything. There's a manual online that is accessible. I can share it in the chat as well. If you use story circles methodology in your workplace, it will hopefully promote active listening skills. And that's a great opportunity for anyone to practice this skill. So UNESCO Story Circles, if you just Google it, you will also find it. But I'll talk more about this at the very end of the presentation. Another skill I'm going to explore is empathy. Okay, we hear this word a lot. We do empathy, but what is it actually? So the capacity to think and feel oneself into the inner life of another person. So you're putting yourself in the shoes of others, right? So you are trying to think or look at the events from someone else's perspective, which is not easy because someone else's perspective might be so different from yours. But at least when you do some effort, make some effort to just think about it from others' perspective, hopefully it will help you understand the feelings and where the other person is coming from. So there are different types of empathy. We have cognitive, emotional, and responding empathy. For cognitive empathy, it's basically like emotional intelligence, like being aware of what other people are, let's say, being aware of other people's feelings. Oh, you're feeling nervous now, you're feeling angry now, right? So kind of identifying what others are feeling. And emotional empathy is kind of feeling the same way the other person is feeling. it's all about feelings. Not you identified the feeling. Now, are you also feeling the same way? You know, and then responding empathy, which is the last one, is responding to someone else's emotional convergence through sympathy and personal stress. So this is not an easy thing. And this is a very, very culturally impacted part of empathy, because in different cultures, we're going to talk about it, your response changes. Not every culture is the same, and not every culture responds in the same way, right? And I can even just give a quick example about silence, for example. When you're listening to other people, sometimes there is silence and you have to respect that silence. But in some cultures, silence means uncomfortable, or means uncomfortable moments, or silence means need to be interrupted and need to be cut so that the conversation will go on and nobody will feel awkward. So even just quick example of silence is totally dependent on culture. And there are so many other examples which might affect the way we respond when we listen to other people. So that's why we're saying cognitive components can be subjective, right? Based on the cultural context. And you might, if you're talking to someone from another background and then you're not familiar with that background and you're listening to that person, then all of a sudden you might need more signals to, how to feel or how to respond to that person, right? Because you're not familiar and you're trying to do your best to react or respond appropriately. And this is called, and it's okay not to know. It's totally fine. It's quite normal to look for more signals to be able to respond appropriately. But it's always important to just acknowledge that, empathy is an important skill of ICC, but at the same time, it is very, very culture focused. So we have to acknowledge that. So we talked about different types of empathy, but since we're talking about allyship and DEI, the most important part of empathy is social empathy here, because social empathy is the ability to understand people by perceiving and experiencing their life situation. This is important. Perceiving or experiencing their life situations as a result, gain insights into structural inequalities and disparities. So when you have individual, personal, relational empathy, this is all about feelings. You're feeling how the other people is, and this can be about anything. But if you're talking about social empathy, this is about structural inequalities. So when you are listening to people from marginalized backgrounds, then you feel like there's something wrong structurally, right? And that's when you feel social empathy, right? And this is very important for allyship because not all interpersonal empathy has potential to foster allyship. You can still feel something for other people. You can still, try to take the other person's perspective, but it doesn't necessarily need to end up with allyship or with social empathy. So they are different empathy types. And also, research shows that social empathy is more likely to promote allyship from privileged group members. So that's why we have to find a way to promote social empathy in our workplaces. And social empathy functions as a catalyst to make dominant group members to take action to make a change. And this comes from, again, that empathy, that empathic feeling that privileged group members feel towards the marginalized group members. Then this happens, they realize, oops, something is wrong. We have to do something about it because I understand how you feel and it's not okay. So that is what social empathy is doing for allyship. And how can we transform cognitive empathy into social empathy in the workplace. So DEI needs to create space for courageous conversations that acknowledge hard truths around systematic inequities. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. Think of your workplace, think of your environment, and these conversations are really, really hard to implement, because how can you make sure people feel comfortable to share and other people feel comfortable to listen? So it is really challenging, and that's why it has to be done in a guided, through a guided maybe structure or questions. So I'm just going a little bit fast because of the time, but we're almost, this is the last intercultural competence skill I'll explore in this presentation, and then we're going to just talk about the next steps and what can be done. So differences. This is another skill, respect and appreciating of differences. And you can use the chat, but I'm just asking, what is your reaction to the different in general? Like whenever you see something different, or whenever you feel like you're changing something, which will be a different thing you're going to do, or any type of different than yours, different than you know, and different than you perceive. So what is your reaction to that? How having different or seeing different makes you feel? Oh, curious. Okay, that's wonderful. I'm looking at the chat. That's wonderful. If you are curious when you see a different thing, then that's wonderful. And that's a wonderful, wonderful skill for intercultural competence as well. Nervous, absolutely. Because when we see something is different, we first like, oh, this is not something I'm used to. So we feel what? Nervous a little bit, right? And it is normal. It is normal. You can feel excited, you can feel curious, you can feel nervous. And Irina said, welcome difference. Yes, yes. That's a wonderful skill too, because when we see something, even if you feel nervous, even if you're excited, no matter how you feel, if you welcome nervousness, that is wonderful. And assessing, yes, Carlos, exactly. Assessing is another, like, okay, difference. Why is it different? What's different? What's going on? You know, so we have different reactions to the different, right? According to research, facing differences in other people might mean re-evaluating their worldviews, which can cause some uncomfortable feelings such as anger, grief, disappointment, and resistance. Okay, so when we face differences in other people, we start re-evaluating things, and it's an uncomfortable feeling, right? Maybe that's why, as you said in the chat, you feel nervous, right? Because it's uncomfortable. But you might be also feeling curious to know more about the difference and make it maybe, familiar instead of different, right? But in general, a majority of people feel uncomfortable. And unfortunately, this puts so many people from marginalized groups into a disadvantage, just situation, right? And people's reactions to differences are assessed by tolerance in the literature. So, whatever you react to difference, that is called tolerance in the literature. And we have tolerance, intolerance, and we have appreciation. Tolerance is, of course, you're expecting and respecting other opinions. So that's totally fine with you, and the important part here is you don't have to agree with the other person. You don't have to agree. Even if you have different opinions, you just respect and you just, say, okay, this is your opinion and this is mine. Intolerance, on the other hand, It's lack of acceptance or respect for other people, which actually causes conflict, right? Discrimination or hostility. So intolerance is the most dangerous area. And unfortunately, in today's world, we see a lot of intolerant people because someone is different, or because someone does not agree with them, or someone is taking a different direction. So unfortunately, this intolerance causes conflict in today's world. And what we need here for intercultural competence, and of course, allyship, and of course, for DEI, is appreciation. Because in appreciation, we not only recognize, but we also respect and celebrate the diversity and diversity of perspectives, cultures, identities, and experiences. So I'm not going to talk about intolerance, right? It's not, we just defined it, and we left it there. What we're going to talk here, tolerance and appreciation. Tolerance is kind of like, okay, that's okay for me, but appreciation is taking a step further and, celebrating the diversity. So that is what we need actually for a more peaceful and more equitable and inclusive workplace. And it's sometimes not easy to do, especially if you're not agreeing with someone, but appreciation is the key. And it takes practice, but after that, after some practice, you're gonna get used to it. And it's really important to see how different is beautiful. Okay. So last few slides and checking the time. So what can we do for appreciating differences in our workplaces, right? So you cannot do it, unfortunately, through one workshop or training. You cannot just say, okay, let's get together and appreciate our differences. It is not authentic. It is not real. And it's not what we do in real life, right? You don't get together with people to appreciate differences, right? Even though it's a good idea, but we don't do it, right? So it should be authentic. It should be real. And it should be like applicable to every day of life, because every day we see something different in our lives. Why don't we appreciate it? And also, we talked about like uncomfortable conversations in workplaces. So what about taking the personal differences first? Because they're easy to start, right? Let's start with our personal differences, like in our comfort space, right? And comfort zone. And after that, let's move to ethnic, racial, and differences and identity differences. Because if you start with that, you might make some people feel uncomfortable directly. So that's why I'm saying, like, scaffolding method, like let's start with like easy differences, then let's go to a little bit more difficult conversations around differences later on. Last slide. In like overall, what can we do for implementing all those intercultural competence skills in our equitable and inclusive workplaces? Of course, workshops, training, they're important. But as I mentioned before, most of the skills are in practice. They are learned in practice, not through workshops. Workshops are always helpful because you're listening, you're learning, you're just conceptualizing things in your mind. But if you just leave it there, it's not going to bring any outcome. So all the workshops or webinars or trainings should be follow up with some hands-on activities in the workplace. But of course, they're very important to start with. Bring more opportunities. For example, as I mentioned, UNESCO Story Circles methodology, which is a free tool that you can use anytime, anywhere, and World Council of Intercultural and Global Competence, which is a free organization that you can join. You can become a member of, and I'm going to share the link with you as well. And they are providing UNESCO Circle methodology trainings for free, and you can join them, you can just listen to them, and you can become a trainer, and then you can take this and implement in your own workplace. And this is like a really easy way to start. If you, especially if you're working in a diverse context, diverse setting, why don't you start with UNESCO Story Circles methodology, and let's see what's going to happen. And this will be a great opportunity for everyone to practice active listening. And develop, of course, develop diverse teams for authentic tasks. Again, if you just bring people together and say, let's talk about diversity and let's talk about differences, let's talk about, it's not authentic and it's not going to help people. And sometimes even people may not be honest. So what is more effective here is bringing diverse people, developing diverse teams around authentic tasks. They should be working together, but they should be completing tasks together instead of just talking about equity and other things, right? Because more interaction and more guided interaction, it is likely to end up just, active listening and also more empathy, more understanding for the others and for differences. And always, always share your respect and appreciation for difference at every opportunity. And you will actually a role model for others as well, because as you practice it on a daily basis, other people will see that you're appreciating differences, and they will also get inspired by that to value differences. And lastly, encourage regular feedback sessions where employees can reflect on their interactions. Reflection is a big part of any type of transformative change, because we learn, we practice, but we rarely question what is changing in ourselves, what is going on. So we need to also make sure we are raising awareness through reflection and, you know, sorry, and making sure that we are understanding what is going on in our inner world. And that's it for now. Yes, I'm great timing. So we might have maybe a few minutes for questions if you have any. So I'm going to stop sharing because I see some comments in the chat. Thank you so much. I'm glad you find it helpful, Cameron. Thank you. Yes, Anna says, I think the brain is hardwired to see change as a threat. So it takes a lot of practice to welcome nervousness. Exactly, that is so true. So it takes practice, and it will be so uncomfortable at the very beginning. But after that, the most important thing is you have to face that it's uncomfortable, and it's okay to feel uncomfortable, right? And okay, Holly says the Cran study with 75% figure was in 2019. That's 5 years ago. I wonder if there is any more recent research to indicate. Oh, that's a great thing, Holly. Yes. We can look into the literature again, but this was the most recent study I found, 2019. Yes, it's been 5 years. We don't know what changed. But even then, 5 years ago, 75% of people said DEI efforts are not effective. But Holly, I'll certainly look into that if there's any recent study or younger than, newer than 5 years old. Irina said, I love the concept of social empathy. Is there a link? Yes, slides will be available for you. I'm happy to put it in the chat as well. And I'm also going to, this will be on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to share a few links in the chat, but meanwhile, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, since I will be sharing a few links. And the first thing I'm going to share is UNESCO Story Circles. And as I mentioned, there's a manual for that, and you can download the manual, implement it in your workplace, and you can also join the World Council of Intercultural and Global Competence. So this is the story circles I've shared in the chat. And the other link I'm sharing is World Council of Intercultural and Global Competence. And it's, again, free membership. You can just join, and you don't have to do anything. You can just look at the sources, join the webinars. So as much as you can join. There's no requirement or anything, and it's free membership. But we are offering really, really good webinars and conferences on forums. So feel free to join any of them. And there was one more thing I was going to share, looking at the chat. Okay. Okay. Any other questions do you have, or anything you want me to clarify before we end the session? Thank you. Thank you so much for all your comments in the chat, and look forward to seeing you again in another conference. And I'm also going to share our YouTube channel here so that you can have access to the recording of this presentation and any other presentation online. So here is the YouTube channel of Peralta Online Equity Conference. Please feel free to subscribe, and then you will have access all recordings. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your days. Bye-bye.